The security guard's hand landed heavily on the black man's shoulder. "Sir, you need to wait like everyone else," he sneered. Little did he know this wasn't just any patient. This was retired Marine Colonel Martin Cole, with 3 Purple Hearts and direct lines to the Joint Chiefs. In 4 minutes, their entire medical empire would begin to crumble. 2. The decorated warrior. Charleston, South Carolina had always been a city of contrasts. Historic architecture and Southern hospitality barely masking deep-rooted tensions that simmer beneath the surface. The Veterans Affairs Medical Center stood as a monument to those who served, its modern facade gleaming in the morning sun. Colonel Martin Cole arrived at the hospital just after dawn. At 58, he carried himself with the unmistakable bearing of a Marine, shoulders back, spine straight, eyes alert. Though he wore civilian clothes, a simple button-down shirt and slacks, there was no disguising the military precision in his movements. 27 years in the Marine Corps had left their mark in more ways than one. Multiple combat deployments to Iraq and Afghanistan had earned him 3 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and countless other commendations. The last deployment had left him with shrapnel buried deep in his left leg. The reason for today's visit: despite his distinguished service record, Martin knew that in civilian spaces, particularly in the South, his accomplishments often disappear behind the color of his skin. He'd spent his career breaking barriers as one of the highest-ranking black officers in the Marine Corps. The price of those broken barriers wasn't just in the sacrifices made overseas, but in the constant need to prove himself worthy in his own country. Martin checked his watch, 7:15 a.m. His appointment wasn't until 8 o'clock, but punctuality had been drilled into him decades ago. The hospital was already buzzing with activity. Nurses rushing through corridors, receptionists fielding calls, veterans of various ages waiting patiently in plastic chairs. He approached the check-in desk. Service record pulled up on his phone. The receptionist barely looked up. "Take a seat. We'll call you." Martin nodded politely, military courtesy overriding any frustration at the curt response. He found a seat near the back wall, away from the main traffic, where he could observe the room. Old habits died hard. As he waited, Martin felt a familiar throbbing in his leg. The shrapnel wound had never fully healed, the metal fragments too dangerously positioned to remove completely. On days like today, when the pain intensified, he was reminded of what service had cost him. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong. Martin's instincts, honed through decades of combat situations, were quietly alerting him. The security guards were watching him more closely than the other patients. One in particular, a heavy-set man with Davidson on his name badge and head of security beneath it, had passed by Martin 3 times in 15 minutes, each glance more suspicious than the last. Martin had seen that look before, the assumption of threat based solely on his appearance. Despite his pressed clothes and quiet demeanor, to some, he was just another black man taking up space where he didn't belong. 3. The confrontation. At 7:45 a.m., a young white veteran was called from the waiting area despite having arrived after Martin. Then another. By 8:30, 30 minutes past the scheduled appointment. Martin approached the desk again. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I had an appointment at 8 o'clock. Has there been a change?" The receptionist frowned without making eye contact. "We're running behind. If you can't wait, you can reschedule." Martin maintained his composure. "I understand you're busy, but I've been waiting since 7:15. Could you check my status?" "Sir," she said with evident irritation, "everyone here is a veteran. Everyone's time is valuable." "I'm not suggesting otherwise," Martin replied evenly. That was when Security Chief Davidson stepped in, positioning himself between Martin and the desk. "Is there a problem here?" His hand rested casually on his taser. "No problem," Martin said. "I'm just inquiring about my appointment." Davidson looked him up and down. "Well, maybe you should take a seat and wait your turn like everyone else. Or is that too much to ask?" Martin noticed several staff members watching now. "My appointment was at 8 o'clock. It's now 8:30. And who are you to demand special treatment?" Davidson stepped closer, invading Martin's personal space. "You people always think you deserve to jump the line." The phrase "you people" hung in the air like a grenade with the pin pulled. Martin straightened his posture reflexively, years of command presence asserting itself. "I haven't demanded anything," Martin replied, his voice controlled but firm. "I'm simply asking about the status of my scheduled appointment." Davidson placed a hand on Martin's shoulder, pushing him back slightly. "I suggest you sit down before you cause a scene, unless you want to be escorted out." The physical contact crossed a line. Martin didn't move, didn't react visibly to the hand on his shoulder, but his eyes, those eyes that had commanded Marines in battle, locked onto Davidson's. "Remove your hand, please," Martin said quietly. Davidson smirked, increasing the pressure. "Or what? You gonna do something about it?" "Davidson!" A voice rang out from the corridor. Dr. Sarah Reynolds, the attending physician, stood with a clipboard in hand, horror evident on her face. "What's going on here?" "Just ensuring compliance, doctor," Davidson replied, not removing his hand. "This guy is being difficult." Dr. Reynolds' eyes widened as she looked at Martin more carefully. "Sir, are you Colonel Cole?" Martin nodded once, still locked in standoff with Davidson. "I've been waiting for you," she said, then turned to Davidson. "Take your hands off him immediately. Do you have any idea who you're manhandling?" Davidson reluctantly withdrew his hand, but maintained his aggressive stance. "Just doing my job." He was getting aggressive with the staff. "That's not what I saw," said an elderly veteran in a wheelchair nearby. Man was just asking about his appointment, calm as can be. Dr. Reynolds stepped closer, her voice dropping to a controlled but furious whisper. "That's Colonel Martin Cole, Davidson. 3 Purple Hearts. Silver Star, one of the most decorated Marine officers of his generation." Davidson's face froze, then shifted through a series of expressions, disbelief, confusion, and finally, a hint of fear. He didn't identify himself as an officer, he stammered. "Should he need to?" Dr. Reynolds asked. "Would you have treated a white veteran this way?" Martin remained calm, but his voice carried the weight of command when he finally spoke. "I'd like to file a formal complaint." 4. Truth revealed. The stillness that fell over the waiting area was absolute. Davidson took a step back, hand falling away from his taser, face draining of color as the implication sank in. The receptionist who had dismissed Martin earlier quietly slipped away from her station. "Colonel Cole," Dr. Reynolds said, her voice filled with respect and embarrassment, "I sincerely apologize for this incident. Please come with me immediately." As Martin followed the doctor, he noticed the other veterans in the waiting area watching. Some looked shocked, others nodded in grim understanding, particularly the older black veterans who had experienced similar treatment countless times. Once inside her office, Dr. Reynolds closed the door and turned to Martin. "Colonel, I am mortified by what just happened. This is completely unacceptable." "Not the first time, Doctor," Martin replied evenly, though usually not quite so public. "That doesn't make it acceptable," she insisted. "Davidson has had complaints before, but nothing this blatant. I'll ensure this is addressed immediately." Martin sat down carefully, the pain in his leg intensifying from the stress of the confrontation. "This isn't about one security guard, doctor, the receptionist, the preferential treatment for other patients. These are symptoms of a larger problem." Dr. Reynolds looked troubled. "You're right, of course. But I hope you know not all of us operate this way." "I'm well aware," Martin said, "which is why this needs to be addressed properly, not swept under the rug." He took out his phone and made a brief call. "James, it's Martin. I need your assistance at the Charleston VA Medical Center." "Yes, officially." He ended the call and looked up at Dr. Reynolds. That was Colonel James Washington, Office of Inspector General for Veterans Affairs. Dr. Reynolds paled slightly. "You're involving the OIG?" "What happened today isn't isolated, Doctor. It's systemic," Martin explained. "I've heard from too many black veterans about similar experiences. The difference is I have the ability to do something about it." A knock at the door interrupted them. The hospital director, a thin man named Richard Grayson, entered without waiting for a response. "Colonel Cole," he said with forced cheerfulness, "I just heard you were here. What an honor to have such a distinguished veteran in our facility." Martin fixed him with a steady gaze. Interesting that I became distinguished only after the confrontation in your lobby. Grayson's smile faltered. A most unfortunate misunderstanding. I assure you, Security Chief Davidson will be reprimanded. This isn't about a reprimand, Martin replied. This is about a pattern of behavior that dishonors the sacrifice of those who served. Grayson's demeanor shifted, his voice lowering. Colonel, perhaps we could discuss this privately? I'm sure we can resolve this matter discreetly. The time for discretion has passed, Martin said, rising to his feet despite the pain. I've already contacted the Inspector General's office. That seems rather extreme for a simple misunderstanding, Grayson protested. Martin's expression hardened. Let me be clear, Director Grayson. I've spent my career watching men and women of all races bleed the same color for this country. Yet when they come home, they're not treated with the same respect. That ends now. As if on cue, Martin's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it, then looked up at Grayson. General Howard Roberts sends his regards. He's very interested in what's happening at this facility. The name dropped like a bomb in the small office. 4-star General Roberts, current vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Martin's former commanding officer, had just entered the equation. 5. The investigation begins. By noon, the Veterans Affairs Office of Inspector General had established a makeshift command center in a conference room at the medical center. Colonel James Washington, a tall, imposing figure with graying temples, directed a team of investigators with military precision. Martin sat across from him, reviewing incident reports and patient complaints that had been buried by administration. These go back 3 years, Martin, Washington said, sliding a folder across the table. Complaints from black veterans about disparate treatment, excessive wait times, security interactions, all mysteriously resolved with no disciplinary action. Martin nodded grimly. How many? 73 documented complaints. Who knows how many went unreported? The door opened, and a young woman in a crisp suit entered. Colonel Washington, we secured the security footage from this morning, plus the last 6 months of lobby interactions. Thank you, Agent Parker, Washington replied. What about the staff interviews? Ongoing, sir. Some are being surprisingly forthcoming, especially the junior staff. They've been seeing this for years, but were afraid to speak up. Martin wasn't surprised. Military culture had taught him how systems protect themselves, how those in power silence dissent and reward compliance. But it had also taught him how to dismantle those systems methodically. James, Martin said quietly, we need to talk to former patients. Not just the ones who complained, but those who might have given up. Washington nodded. Already on it. We got a team reaching out to every black veteran who canceled follow-up appointments or transferred to other facilities. Martin's phone rang. General Roberts calling for an update. Martin excused himself to take the call in private. It's worse than we thought, Howard, Martin said after explaining the situation. This isn't isolated to Charleston. Based on what we're finding, this could be happening at facilities across the country. You have my full support, Martin, the general replied. Whatever resources you need. The Secretary of Defense has been briefed, and he's speaking with the VA secretary this afternoon. Meanwhile, Hospital Director Grayson was frantically calling an emergency meeting with his administrative team. Security Chief Davidson sat glumly in the corner, already placed on administrative leave. This is a disaster, Grayson hissed. We have the damn Inspector General crawling through our records, and Colonel Cole has the ear of the Joint Chiefs. We should cooperate fully, Dr. Reynolds suggested. This is an opportunity to address real problems. Don't be naive, snapped Administrator Phillips, a longtime colleague of Grayson's. If they dig too deep, we'll all be implicated. The preferential treatment policies, the resource allocation differences between wards, all of it. What preferential treatment policies? Dr. Reynolds asked, suddenly alert. Phillips exchanged a glance with Grayson, who quickly intervened. Margaret simply means our triage procedures, which are entirely standard. That's not what she said, Dr. Reynolds insisted, a sinking feeling in her stomach. What exactly have you been implementing without the medical staff's knowledge? Before anyone could answer, Agent Parker appeared at the doorway. Director Grayson, We'll need access to all administrative records for the past 5 years, including your resource allocation meetings and staffing decisions. The room fell silent as the true scope of the investigation became clear. 6. Power struggle. By evening, the story had leaked to local media. Decorated Black Marine Colonel faces discrimination at VA hospital, headlined the Charleston Post and Courier. Martin's military photo, in full dress uniform with rows of medals, was juxtaposed against the hospital's entrance. Martin hadn't sought publicity, but he didn't shy from it either. His years commanding Marines had taught him that sometimes the most effective strategy was to bring problems into the light. Director Grayson was in full damage control mode, having called an emergency board meeting. "This is a public relations nightmare," he told the assembled hospital leadership. "We need to get ahead of this." "By doing what?" asked Dr. Reynolds, who had been invited as the chief of medicine. "Denying there's a problem?" "By acknowledging concerns while emphasizing our commitment to all veterans," Grayson replied smoothly. "We'll announce a review of procedures, diversity training for staff, the usual toolkit." "With all due respect," Dr. Reynolds countered, "I think we're well beyond that. Colonel Cole isn't looking for a press release. He wants substantial changes." "What Colonel Cole wants isn't my primary concern," Grayson said dismissively. "My job is to protect this institution." "Your job," came a voice in the doorway, "is to serve veterans. All veterans." Martin stood there alongside Colonel Washington and 2 other officers in uniform. The room fell silent. "This meeting is private," Grayson protested. "Not anymore," Washington replied, placing a document on the table. "By authority of the Secretary of Veterans Affairs, this facility is now under administrative review. All operational decisions must be cleared through our office until further notice." Grayson's face flushed with anger. "This is unprecedented. You can't just—" "We can and we have," Martin interrupted calmly. "We spent the afternoon reviewing patient records, staff complaints, and resource allocations. The disparities are undeniable." He placed a folder on the table and opened it, revealing charts and statistics. Black veterans wait an average of 42 minutes longer for initial assessment. They are prescribed pain medication at rates 30% lower than white veterans with identical conditions. Security interventions involving Black veterans are 3.5 times more frequent. The data spoke for itself, filling the room with uncomfortable silence. "This isn't about one security guard," Martin continued. "It's about institutional practices that have been normalized and protected. We have limited resources," Administrator Phillips protested. "Difficult decisions have to be made. Interesting that those difficult decisions consistently disadvantage certain veterans," Washington observed. Grayson attempted to regain control. "Whatever issues exist, I'm sure we can address them internally without this federal overreach." Martin fixed him with a steady gaze. "Like you addressed the previous 73 complaints? Or the staff concerns that were systematically ignored? Or perhaps like you addressed the missing funds from the veteran support programs?" The last point landed like a bombshell. Grayson's face went pale. "What missing funds?" asked a board member. "Over the past 3 years," Washington explained, "approximately $1.2 million allocated for veteran support services was redirected to administrative expenses and facility upgrades, primarily in areas serving higher income, predominantly white patients." The revelation fractured the room's solidarity. Board members exchanged alarmed glances while Grayson attempted to form a response. Those allocations were approved by the board. He finally managed, based on misleading information, Martin countered. "Our team found the original proposals and compared them to what was actually presented to the board. The discrepancies are significant." A board member stood up, visibly shaken. "I think we need to cooperate fully with this investigation. If what Colonel Cole is saying is true, we have failed in our oversight responsibilities." The balance of power had shifted. 7. Hidden truths exposed. As the investigation deepened over the next few days, more veterans came forward with their stories. Martin established a listening post in a community center near the hospital, where veterans could share their experiences confidentially. Retired Sergeant Marcus Jenkins described being accused of drug-seeking behavior when requesting pain management for combat injuries. Former Corporal Darnell Williams recounted being physically restrained by security after questioning why his appointment had been canceled without notice. Dozens more shared similar stories, patterns of dismissal, suspicion, and differential treatment. "They treat us like we're trying to scam the system," said Jenkins, "like we didn't earn these benefits with our blood." Meanwhile, the investigation uncovered a disturbing network within the hospital administration. Emails between Grayson, Davidson, and Phillips revealed an explicit policy of additional scrutiny for certain patients, coded language that clearly targeted minority veterans. Most damning was a private chat group where Davidson and several security personnel shared derogatory comments about black veterans, including jokes about combat stress being used as an excuse. When confronted with this evidence, Davidson attempted to deflect. It was just locker room talk, blowing off steam from a high-stress job. "Interesting," Martin replied coldly. "I commanded Marines in active combat zones for 27 years. Somehow we managed without dehumanizing the people we served with." The investigation also revealed connections to broader problems. Funds meant for PTSD support programs serving predominantly Black and Latino veterans had been systematically redirected. Specialized care programs have been understaffed while administrative positions multiplied. The most shocking discovery came when they found evidence linking Grayson to a private healthcare consortium that had been quietly contracting services from a VA at inflated rates. Services that should have been provided in-house. "It's not just racism," Washington explained to Martin as they reviewed the findings. "It's using racial bias as cover for financial corruption. The veterans who received the worst treatment were the ones least likely to be believed if they complained." Martin nodded grimly. "Using prejudice as a shield for profit, weaponizing existing biases." The investigation expanded beyond Charleston, with similar patterns emerging at 3 other VA facilities in the Southeast. What had begun as one Marine colonel standing up against discriminatory treatment was becoming a regional reckoning. 8. Justice prevails. 2 weeks after the initial incident, a formal hearing was convened at the regional VA headquarters. The room was packed with officials, veterans, reporters, and hospital staff. Director Grayson, Security Chief Davidson, and Administrator Phillips sat one table, their attorneys beside them. Martin, Colonel Washington, and the OIG team occupied another. The VA Deputy Secretary himself presided, having flown in from Washington, D.C., given the case's significance and the attention it had received from the highest levels of military leadership. "Before we begin," the Deputy Secretary announced, "I want to make it clear that the Department of Veterans Affairs exists for one purpose only, to serve those who have served our nation. Any failure in that mission is unacceptable." The evidence presentation was methodical and devastating. Financial records, patient testimonies, statistical analyses, and internal communications form an irrefutable case of systemic discrimination enforced through institutional practices. When it was Martin's turn to speak, he rose slowly, still fighting the pain in his leg that had brought him to the hospital in the first place. "I didn't start this fight because of what happened to me," he began. "I started it because of what's happening to veterans who don't have the rank or connections to fight back. Men and women who serve their country with honor, only to be treated with suspicion and contempt when they seek the care they've earned." He looked directly at Grayson and Davidson. "When I was a young lieutenant, my commanding officer taught me that leadership isn't about protecting yourself or your institution. It's about protecting those under your care. You failed that most basic test of leadership." The Deputy Secretary's decision was swift and unequivocal. Grayson, Davidson, and Phillips were removed from their positions, pending criminal investigation into financial improprieties. An oversight committee, including veteran representatives, would guide reforms at the facility. And most significantly, a nationwide review of VA practices would be initiated to identify similar patterns elsewhere. Colonel Cole, the Deputy Secretary, said as the hearing concluded, "On behalf of the Department of Veterans Affairs, I extend our deepest apologies. Your courage in bringing these issues to light exemplifies the highest traditions of military service." Martin nodded in acknowledgement but added, "The real test will be whether things actually change. Apologies without action are just words." 3 months later, Martin returned to the Charleston VA Medical Center as a member of the Veterans Advocacy Committee. What happened that day sparked change beyond one hospital. It became a national conversation about how we honor those who've sacrificed everything. As he watched diverse veterans now receiving equal care, Martin reflected on a greater truth. Justice isn't a destination, but a continuous journey requiring vigilance. The battle for dignity shouldn't be harder than the battles fought overseas. Yet for many black veterans, it remains so. This isn't just a military story. It's about standing firm when systems fail us, about one person's courage-inspiring collective action. Martin's stand reminds us that true patriotism means holding our institutions accountable to their highest ideals. What's your experience with institutional change? Have you witnessed someone bravely challenging an unjust system? Share your thoughts below. If this story moved you, give a like so others can find it too. Subscribe for more powerful stories of courage and transformation that remind us change is always possible when we're brave enough to demand it. Remember, sometimes the most powerful act of service is speaking truth to power, in uniform or out of it.